Being a headmaster in a school demands a variety of skills and must be a very challenging job. Here with me today is someone who heads up one of our area's most prestigious schools. It's Dr Dorian Lewis, head teacher at Bournemouth School. Dorian, welcome. Thanks for coming in.
Thank
What do
you
you
for
think of our
inviting.
studio here?
Wonderful.
We're going to take a look at the role of a head teacher and how it's evolved for you, the challenges that you face,
Yeah.
and the successes that you've had over the years. But let's just start with a bit of your background,
Okay.
if we may. Where did you grow up?
Grew up in South Wales, in an area that's quite deprived. My parents were very normal working class people. I benefited from going to the local grammar school, which meant that I was then the first person in my family to go to university.
Right.
And that's how it all began, really.
When you went to university, you came a bit closer to us here, didn't you?
I did. I went to Southampton University. I was there for my bachelor's degree. I was then fortunate in having, at the end of it, being offered to stay on and do a PhD. And that was an interesting discussion with my father, actually, because I had thought about teaching at that point, and he felt that I should take advantage of whatever educational opportunities were offered. And so I began to do that.
Where did you go to train to teach?
I went to the University of Nottingham. I was there for a year to do a postgraduate certificate in education. And as these things happen, just before I was due to go up to Nottingham, I met a girl that was in Southampton. So I spent most of the time travelling backwards and forwards.
Right. And your first post was down this way as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. So I was fortunate in being offered a position at what was then called the Dorchester Thomas Hardy School, and an inspirational leader, Dr Ian Melvin, who was quite hard work in some ways, but very focused on giving the very best deal for the pupils that he served, and that's a sort of philosophy that stayed with me.
And from there, you moved on to Queen Elizabeth School in Wimborne, a school with
Yes.
a proud reputation as well.
Yeah.
What was your career there, and what changes did you make?
Well, I started there as the head of science. I was a fairly inexperienced head of science at that point. And again, it was really about having a more clinical look at how we could best serve the pupils by giving them the best results possible. So it was about putting in the structures and systems in place to do that. So I did that, and as part of that, I then got interested in assessment, target setting, and timetabling. And then I think 4 or so years later, the deputy head got a promotion, a vacancy arose, and I was fortunate enough to get that. So I then stayed there for a further 7 years after that.
And then from there, you got your first, is it headship? Is that the
First,
right?
yes, first headship, which was, I remember well, the night, it was a Friday evening, and in those days you used to get the Times Ed, we called it, that had all the jobs in it, and you'd get it on a Friday. And I wasn't particularly looking for a different role, but I opened the paper up, and my wife's from Bournemouth originally,
Right.
and I looked through all of the advertisements, and there was a role at Bournemouth School advertised, and I asked her, well, how would you fancy that? How would you fancy me doing that? And she said, go for it. So I did. It was the first headship I applied for, and I was fortunate enough to get it.
When I went to school against Bournemouth School's big rivals, I went to Poole Grammar School.
Yeah,
We beat them every time we played at rugby, by the way.
not anymore.
Yeah, but that's because I've retired. When you first started, it was it still Bournemouth School for boys then? Was it?
So this has been a constant source of argument at home.
Right.
As I said, my wife's from Bournemouth. She's always referred to it as BSB. And I have to correct her and you know that it's actually never been BSB.
Really?
No,
I didn't
no,
know that.
No, it was originally set up as Bournemouth School.
Right.
There was no girls' school at the time. And
Right.
a little later, the girls' school came along, BSG.
Yeah.
And therefore, to distinguish between the two, colloquially, it's been known as BSB, but it's officially always been Bournemouth School.
You learn something new every day. So take yourself back to the first day in the school.
Yeah.
What was your sort of objectives when you arrived at the school?
if I'm honest with you,
Yeah.
there was a lot there that was outstanding about the school, and it's still the case today that the most outstanding feature of the school are the pupils. The
Hmm.
pupils are wonderful, but I felt at that point that many of them were succeeding despite the teaching,
Right.
because essentially the students were bright enough to overcome issues that there might have been in terms of the quality of the material that was being delivered to them, because you could give them a revision guide and within a month they were up to speed and they would get a reasonable grade at GCSE. Not so much at A level, but certainly at GCSE they would be able to.
Hmm.
And that wasn't right, and it wasn't necessarily supporting those that weren't quite as able or motivated. And the other issue that I had is that it had become what I would term a pseudo-independent school, in that it didn't have a catchment area. And so therefore, those that were from further afield, perhaps the New Forest, would be able to get their children into our school, and would be able to fund the transport to and from. So rather than perhaps going to a local independent school, they were using our school as that, and we weren't really serving the local community well enough and enhancing their social mobility.
That's a really interesting point, because obviously there's lots of arguments for and against the existence of grammar schools, and some
Absolutely.
people see them as elitist in a way,
Hmm.
the nearest thing that can be elite if you don't go for private education. Yeah.
Yeah.
So why would you say that that's an unfair view, if somebody from the New Forest wants to send their child to the best school and they were able to do it? Why is that wrong?
Because I think it runs against my background. It
Hmm.
runs against
Yeah.
my views
Hmm.
of children should have the same opportunities regardless of the wealth and the income of their parents. And I've always tried to ensure that as far as possible, and I can't solve everything, but as far as possible, it is as much a meritocracy as possible, so that there is no difference in the opportunities that a child of a certain ability, let's say from a deprived area of Bournemouth, would have to someone that was in an affluent position in the middle of the New Forest.
But they've still got to pass an entry exam.
They do, and that, if you like, is the bit I have difficulty with still, because if I could wave a magic wand and create a test that did not that could not be coached, and no matter what people say, there will always be an element of that. That's what I would do. But we've done all that we can to level that playing field. We go out to the local primary schools, we promote ourselves, we give support to those that are less advantaged, to try and give them the leg up and come to our school.
How did your own upbringing and going to a grammar school yourself as a young lad, how did that shape your views as the head of a grammar school?
I think it impressed upon me the power of education to change lives. Lots of my friends ultimately left our hometown, and have done some fantastic things. And I'm not sure that is available to children there anymore, because as we were there in I think the third year, it became a comprehensive school. There was a political agenda in
Yeah.
South Wales for grammar schools to go, and you could see a decline in standards and a decline in aspirations thereafter. I've kept in touch with the school vaguely because my sister still lives just around the corner. So when we visit her, I still see my old school. But it's not the same school. It doesn't give the same opportunities now that it did when I was there.
That seems to sort of conflict with what you just said about trying to get people from the local catchment area, because if you drop the entry standards, then you potentially drop the results that come out the other end as well. I'm not saying I disagree with you at all, but I'm interested to know how you sort of balance those two things really as well.
So what you're suggesting is the same argument that some members of the then governing body had.
Yeah.
And they said, if you decide to essentially restrict the catchment area to Bournemouth or just around Bournemouth, the standards will go down.
Yeah.
And you have to change the pass mark. And that has happened. We have changed the pass mark. We have very few now that come from outside BCP. The standards have gone up.
Yeah.
It's not about the raw material that you get in. It's what you do with it once they're there.
Yeah.
And if I could have something that was measuring more accurately their attitude than perhaps their innate ability in English or maths, then that's something we could work with.
I read the most recent OFSTED report, which was, for those that wouldn't know and are not from this area, it was across the board, it was outstanding, which is an incredible achievement, isn't it? OFSTED sometimes gets a bad press, doesn't it? What's your view on does it need to exist, for example?
I should declare that I did work for OFSTED at one stage.
I didn't know that.
But that was because I thought the best way of me being a more effective poacher was to become a gamekeeper. So I did that for a short while. Having a body that does look at standards is important. I'm not sure always that Ofsted get it right in the way that they're doing their inspections. As a serving head teacher working for Ofsted, I felt it incumbent upon me to give the head teacher the heads up of things that would never go in the report, but that I had seen that maybe needed to be addressed. Because there must be a role for sharing best practice across across an education environment. So I think it does need to exist. I'm just not sure that it's got it quite right.
What do you think makes a good head teacher?
Honesty, humility, and having at the forefront of your mind serving the students, because that's what we're there for. And there have been some times, being the head of Bournemouth School, where that's been quite difficult sometimes because you've had to make decisions that you knew would not be unpopular, particularly with staff.
Yeah.
Sometimes with parents, but particularly with staff. But you know it's in the best interests of the students, so therefore that's what you need to do.
Now, I have it on authority, and perhaps you can confirm or deny this rumour, but you mentioned about serving students.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody told me that you literally serve students with, is that right?
Well, actually, today I'm going back to do that.
Perhaps you'd like to explain.
Well, if we're short-staffed, I will volunteer to go and work in the kitchens. You can probably tell that I do quite like food. But
you said that, not me.
But it's I think it's important that as a head teacher that you are prepared to do whatever needs to be done. And it also means that if I'm there serving the students, they see me in a slightly different context. It breaks down some of those barriers that are there. I've always been conscious of the fact that because of my position, students might not be as open with me. They might not be as willing to come and talk to me. But if they see me serving the meals at lunchtime, it's a different context. Now they say, oh, actually, this guy is fairly normal. I'm not very normal, but fairly normal. And you know, I think it sends a good message out that we're a team working. Everyone that is there in the school, whether they are a member of support staff, a teacher, a head of department, myself, we're all there for the students' best interests.
It's a very good point about accessibility and not coming across as too remote. You made some changes over the first few years. What kind of changes did you make?
I suppose the biggest change was that change in the ethos, in saying that we are serving a community, a local community, rather than having a catchment area that could extend infinitely. One of the first things I did actually when I came there was said, right, we need some principles that we're going to give everybody to work with. And I manufactured the idea of hard work, discipline, smart appearance, and most importantly, respect.
Yeah.
And then those four things have stayed with us throughout my tenure, and I hope would go on beyond that. because I think if we get those four things right, everything else falls into place.
We're falling down on all of those areas, across society,
Yeah,
and it's leading to quite a lot of disruption in everybody's
yeah,
lives, isn't it?
yeah.
Going back to the discipline side of that, actually, before I move on, you adopt a sort of no tolerance policy in certain cases, don't you? Tell me a
Pretty
little bit
much.
about your views.
There are certain things where I would say there's a red line. And I think we, as a society, have stopped having red lines as much, and we have, they're becoming blurred. If I give you an example, if you're driving your car and you want to park it and you see there's no parking there, and you park there and you get a ticket, well, you shouldn't moan about it afterwards, because you knew full well that if you were going to park there, and there isn't an excuse for it. And I've been very clear with parents that there are red lines in what we do. So the obvious ones are, if someone brings a knife into school, there's not an excuse for it. Well, I can't think of an excuse for it. If someone brings in illegal drugs into school, I can't think why they should be a member of our society, our school community. And whilst children will always make mistakes, and if they make a mistake, they recognise it, and they'll work with us to put it right, then by and large we can keep them in part of our community and we can work with them. But there are just a few things that you're saying, actually, we did tell you this was wrong. You can't do this. And if you do it, that's not something we'll tolerate.
How important are the role, or is the role, of parents in helping you maintain that standard?
It's vitally important, and I will say to parents that we have to work together, because I think our young people are facing challenges now that we never faced in our lives. It's a very different set of circumstances growing up now with social media, all of the influence, the pressure for them to grow up so quickly. And I think parents are sometimes ill-equipped to deal with it. And I'll speak from personal experience. I've got three, and they all went through different things when they were younger. And even though in my role it was quite difficult to really appreciate exactly what they were going through, a trivial example would be understanding what restrictions you would put on an iPhone, for instance.
Yeah.
So some parents come into their child developing into a teenager with no real skill set to deal with it.
Yeah.
So it's our responsibility to help them and to try and get the dialogue between the parents and the school, that we turn to each other for support so we can put in the best possible provision for their child.
But not all parents see it that way, do they? And
unfortunately, no.
Yeah, and you need to call on their support as well, as you've already said. But what about those times when parents just don't want to listen, and they're just conflicting with you for the sake of it? They just got their own viewpoint and it's not compatible with yours.
Well, ultimately it's a choice to send their child to my school.
Yeah.
So I will be very clear with parents that I think one of the issues is that everyone has an experience, or virtually everyone has an experience of school.
Yeah.
So if you've got an experience, you become an expert. But I will quite happily have a conversation with the parents saying, well, that may be what you think, that may be what you want for your child. That's not something that we offer. There are other alternatives.
Right.
Now, I'm in a very fortunate position because I can do that, because I've got a waiting list to get into my school.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to have a very clear set of standards and say, if you send your child here, this is what will happen. So we'll always treat your child with dignity and respect, but there are red lines and we expect them to behave a certain way.
Data analysis and pastoral care are two subjects that are close to your heart, aren't they?
Yeah.
Let's hear about how they've impacted school life.
I think sometimes people can get very confused with data.
Mm-hmm.
And I am an Excel geek. So
Right.
I can manipulate data however you wish to give you whatever statistical answer you want at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think the important thing on data analysis is actually identifying what it tells you and then addressing that. And often the data analysis will tell you that there is an issue either within a department or there's an issue within the pastoral care for your student body. And I think it's trying to cut through the forest so that you can actually see the tree.
Now, we're both senior people. Let's be
Yes.
polite.
Yes.
It gets harder, doesn't it, every year to maintain that sort of freshness with technology because it's developed so fast. AI being an example. Yeah.
AI, if I'm honest, does frighten me. I use it. I'm concerned about people losing the ability to think for themselves,
Yeah.
to be creative. We have quite often a debate at home when we might be sat around watching the television, and my wife will say, "Who's that actor there?" or "Who's that person married to?" And I'll say, just wait a moment. And she'll be on her phone Googling. I say, "No, put the phone away. I need to remember it
Yeah.
because I need to get my brain training."
Yeah.
And we do a lot of work in school with the students now about making sure that we are applying the latest in cognitive science, so they are training their brains. There are challenges within it, but the fundamentals remain the same.
Yeah.
About trying to make sure that students enjoy the subject, understand the subject, and ultimately can pass the exams and can have open to them the doors that they want opened in the future.
My daughter said to me last night, actually, she said, "Why don't you use AI to help you write your questions?" And that was like a personal attack as far as I was concerned. It was like, no way. These come from the heart, and from some of your students, actually, as we'll
Yeah.
find out. And I said, but these come from the heart, and I will ask them in my words. AI, no chance.
I think it's actually trying, from my understanding, it's using AI appropriately.
Yeah.
So sometimes you can imagine I might get a 500-page document from the Department for Education that lands on my desk.
Yeah.
Well, if I've got AI, I can say, right, give me a 500-word summary,
Right.
and it will
Good.
do it.
Yeah.
You know, so there are, and if you give it the right sources, it can give you answers that are appropriate.
The second part of that question, going back a couple of questions, was about pastoral care. You've got quite a diversity of people at your
Yeah.
school. How much of an issue or how much importance is there that pastoral care plays?
It's vitally important. If a child's not feeling secure, safe, and happy, they're not going to thrive in our environment. And I use the same mantra. If I've got a senior leader that's in charge of the pastoral system, I've got a senior leader that might be in charge of a subject area, I'll say ultimately, just what would you want for your child? What would you want put in place for your child? And if they can answer that, then I'm happy.
Right.
It's when you might be sat at the back of a lesson and you might say, if my child were here, I'd be really upset because they're not getting what they need. Or if my child was feeling anxious, was feeling unsupported, and there was no one there for them to talk to, there was no system in place to make sure that they felt that security within school, then you'd be upset.
And that really goes back to the point about you being accessible, because that filters down, and therefore the student might feel more able to open up if they've got a problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about people with physical difficulties? How well is the school geared up to take those in?
Well, you have to remember that our building was built in 1939.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that we've got corridors that aren't quite as wide as they need to be. We've got staircases. It's not, for someone with a physical disability, it's not well suited.
So how do you
throughout the
overcome
building.
it?
Well, we overcome it by changing their timetable.
Right.
So we do have the ability to change their timetable so that they would be on one floor, they'd be on the ground floor. We do things like we might have a teaching assistant or another pupil that would go with them and leave. They might leave a lesson 5 minutes early. They might arrive 5 minutes late, depending on the nature of their disability, about whether they're in a busy corridor, is that good for them or not. So we put in all sorts of measures to make sure that they're able to have a full experience of being at school. But it's not always ideal.
My daughter is bilingual, but more and more across the country now, we're seeing people where English is their
Yeah.
second language. How do you help those who struggle with English as a language?
That's a difficult question for us to answer, if I'm honest, because
Hmm.
we benefit from having a probably a more diverse community in our school than across Bournemouth, or certainly across Dorset. Generally, about 20% of our intake have English as an additional language, but it's that additional language because obviously to come to us, they have to pass an entrance test, and that part of that is in English. So by and large, their spoken English and written English is actually quite good.
Right. Yeah, so it's not something
It's
that
not
you're,
quite the
no,
same.
no, okay. How would you advise? Because I know that you go
Mm,
to groups with other head teachers and stuff who
yeah.
must face that kind of problem. What kind of advice would you pass on to them?
I think it's looking carefully at the diet that you're going to serve them,
Right.
and actually making sure that there's enough time devoted to some of the basic literacy skills and reading in order for them to access other parts of the curriculum. Because I often feel that we don't spend enough time considering that, or we might have a focus earlier in school about learning materials before the basics are there. It may seem odd. As a scientist, I'm never really sure why someone in early years or primary school needs to do very much science. I didn't do any science when I was in school.
Really?
The focus needs to be on the basics, the English, the maths, because when they come to a secondary environment where the facilities would be very different, the staff would have a different skill set, then you can actually teach them all the science they need to know in that time. But actually, the basics, the communication skills, the numeracy skills, the getting on with people, to my mind, that's more important as they're coming to me.
I'm so glad you mentioned communication because my daughter, her friends, anybody who
Mm,
comes in here, I say you can, do the best you can at your education, but communication, it doesn't matter what you
mm,
do as an adult, communication throughout your life is going to be important. If you can communicate well, you get on well. And she's
yeah,
heard me say that 1,000 times or
yeah,
more, but it's so true, isn't it?
absolutely.
And okay, grant funding. It's played a big part in helping the school develop as well, hasn't it?
Okay.
Particularly in respect of the sixth form. What kind of improvements has the school benefited from?
The education environment is quite different to what people may perceive. There's a lot of my job is making sure that we get the funding that we need, so we can improve our buildings, the infrastructure. So in my time, we've probably brought in about £10 million worth of additional funding on top of the funding we get year on year. Things that we've done, we've got a new block that cost about £5.5 million, which is a sixth form study centre, a new dining room, kitchen, 6 classrooms above, and some toilets. More recently, we've had all of the heating changed in the school, so it's now zoned and should be more efficient. We've got some air conditioning in some rooms. We've put in new computer suites. So it's a constant renewal of the building stock. So at the moment, we've got a project to change all the fire doors. So that's another £500,000.
Right.
So there's always something going on.
Everybody would want more money,
Yeah.
and more money thrown at the NHS, education, whatever. Um, but how much of a battle is it to financially survive these days as a school?
You have to be quite careful about how you're spending money. And again, my school's situation is different to those that in more challenging circumstances. And I would always want to recognise that fact, and I would want to work within a system that was trying to give a fair funding to everybody. But there are some decisions that you would make as a head teacher that can have long term repercussions. So if I give you an example, if you allow a sixth form offer to have lots of subjects where there are only two or three in a class, that's a really inefficient model,
Yeah.
and that will come back and bite you. If you've got too many support staff, it will come back and bite you. So we took some decisions quite early on to make the staffing very tight. That does mean that sometimes you have class sizes that are larger than you would want, but you then have to do a cost-benefit analysis.
Right.
Because once you've got a member of staff in, it's quite difficult to then move them on. You can't just move your staffing year on year.
Right.
And that's the biggest on your year-to-year funding. It's the level of staffing that you have that is the biggest driver of your budget.
Have you ever made a mistake and reflected on it and think, I really wish I didn't do that? Sorry, that's such an unfair question. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I would say daily. I don't think. I think we have to have the. I said earlier, I think one of the main features is to have the humility to say, yes, I will make mistakes. So I think looking back, there have been, we looked at virtually everyone doing four A levels rather than 3. And I think pushing more of them down that route was a mistake. We did it for very well-founded reasons at the time, but I don't think that was right.
I think it's great that you can say, hey, I got something wrong, because we all make mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's how you respond to it, isn't it? Here's a question from students, actually.
These are the ones I'm most fearful of. Go on.
I thought I'd drop this in. The school day is split into 6 lessons, and some schools go for 5. What's your thinking behind that?
Well, some schools go for 4. Some schools,
really?
There are all sorts of patterns out there. So part of it is historic. So when I arrived at the school, there were 5 lessons, each of an hour. So I would go in and observe lessons, and I noticed quite quickly that by the time we were towards the last 10 minutes, the pace of the lesson had dropped off. Everyone was just watching the clock and waiting for the bell to go.
Right.
So that was one feature. The other feature was that there was an aspiration at that time that there would be a triangle of educational excellence in our area. So Bishop of Winchester School, that had just become an academy, that we were supporting, Bournemouth School for Girls and ourselves would work together to try and put together a 6th form package that would have a variety of options. So they'd have A levels, which obviously we had a track record in, but also BTEC courses as well. And the idea was that students would be able to take a mix of courses across the 3 schools, but to facilitate the movement, you needed to divide the school day into thirds.
Thirds?
So if you divide it into thirds, then logically you divide into 6. So you have a 6-period day where you can have double periods. So if someone were doing a BTEC course at another school, they had the travel time in between to go to it. Now that plan fell apart, not for anything that we were doing, but because when I think the governing board of Bishop of Winchester School looked at their 6th form, they said, actually, we want to do A levels, we want to compete.
Right.
So then we don't work with them in the same way anymore.
I was racking my brain to when I was at school, and which was a very long time ago, and I think we had 40-minute lessons.
I had 40-minute lessons when I was in school.
Yeah, I think it was 7 if I remember
and
right.
I think there's a sweet spot between a lesson being too short and a lesson being too long, and it will. And unfortunately, it changes subject to subject. If you're doing practical work, then sometimes in year 13, when you're doing an elaborate chemistry practical, you need a double lesson.
Yeah.
Other times, a double lesson can drag.
Yeah. We've got some great schools in this area. We're very, very fortunate.
Yeah.
What makes Bournemouth School the top of the tree as far as you're concerned?
I'd probably come back first of all and argue how you define top of the tree.
Your definition.
My definition. I think what we do is we have high aspirations, or we encourage our students to have high aspirations, and we give them the confidence to try and attain them.
Your academic results are outstanding, aren't they? Just blow your own trumpet here. Give me some of the kind of statistics here.
At the moment, it's a bit of a movable feast, isn't it? Because the government are moving things around, and the latest results, for instance, those ones that did GCSEs didn't have Key Stage 2 results because of COVID, so you can't do the value added. Value added year before was 0.56, which means students on average are adding a half a grade above what that you'd expect them to do.
Right.
This year's results in terms of the attainment were actually higher. So the baseline of our students tends not to change very much year on year. So if they're attaining more highly, actually the progress is higher. So I'd be expecting the progress in the last set of results would have been around 1. We have a huge number of students at the end of year 13 that achieve incredibly well. I mean, we've had, I think, this year we've had 7 go to Oxford or Cambridge. We've had 7 go off to do medicine or dentistry. And we've got one who came to us at the beginning of year 12 and we supported through and is now studying at Princeton. But not only is he studying at Princeton, everything's being paid for him.
Wow.
And it's
and you helped him,
and we helped him. When he came to us, he hadn't any idea that this was a possibility. Because we've had ones do it before, we said, well, because you're from a less wealthy background, we can work with you and the Sutton Trust, and we can give you opportunities that you might not realise. And he's now got that.
Following on from that, actually, we're in a global society now, and there is, in some ways, there's more opportunity to go and get higher education overseas. And obviously, since Brexit, it's also a little bit more difficult for the moment, at least. How do you support and encourage other students who might want to go, say, somewhere in Europe, for example, Spain, Holland?
Yeah, so we've had mainly people go to either Spain. We've had some go to Holland, but it's normally either Spain or they go to the US. And it's increasingly what we're finding is the best people to advise students now about what to do are the students we've had previously. Right. So we have a really good system where I've got a wonderful colleague that coordinates all of our links with all of the past students who now will come in and give them talks about, well, this is what I'm doing now, these are the opportunities I've had, this is where I've been.
Critics of grammar schools would say that they're elitist.
Yeah.
And high academic results that you do achieve should be a minimum expectation. How would you answer that?
They should be.
Yeah, well, that's a brilliant answer. Yeah.
And yes, but actually, I think if you were to come to our school, and this is what I say to the parents, if you want your child to end their secondary education like our year 13s that we've got now, that's why you send your child to our school. It's not just about the academic outcomes, it's also about the confidence that they have, the ability to communicate effectively with a wide audience, whether it's children or adults, and it's carrying themselves with that degree of self-esteem, really.
What improvements do you see as still necessary at Bournemouth School?
It will never be finished. There'll always be improvements. I think the improvements now are possibly, in terms of teaching and learning, are more incremental than radical changes. If I had the funding, yes, we'd have newer buildings, we'd have better facilities, but it ultimately is the quality of the teachers and the quality of the educational provision that we give is the most important thing. And we are, I think, to an extent, after COVID, we lagged behind a little. I took the decision at that time to focus on the students' well-being rather than worry about their academic progress. And of course, coming out of COVID, then we had the opportunity to go in and see what other schools were doing. So we worked with Twynham, The Grange, Poole High. Poole High were fantastic for us. Bourne Academy, Ferndown Upper. And we went in to see what they were doing. And we stole with pride all of the things they're doing that we thought we could use. We've then modified them. We've done quite a lot of research in terms of what's happening out there globally, and we've adopted the best practices, and we're still working on that, and that's having a significant effect on students' grades.
In effect, you are in competition with these other schools that you've mentioned,
Yeah.
but collaboration is still important.
I think we have to have, again, that word humility, the humility to say that we're not going to get everything right, and other people will have better ideas than we do. And I'm very happy for schools to come and see what we do, as long as they understand we're not putting ourselves up as paragons of virtue. But I'm also happy to go and see other schools and see what they do really well, and work together to put it, because ultimately we're here for the children. And it's not just my children, it's their children as well. Yeah. And if we can work together to improve it, that's what we should be doing.
School's got a head boy, hasn't it?
A school captain.
A school captain, right?
Which is very gender neutral.
Right, okay. But it's still a boy.
It is a boy, and there hasn't yet been a girl that has become a school captain.
Yeah, this is a student question.
Yeah.
Okay, based around that. Why has there not been a girl?
So we've only started having girls since 2012, formally as part of our school. Before then, there was a loose collaboration with Bournemouth School for Girls down the hill. But they've only been on our roll since 2012. And there is no impediment. There's nothing written to say that we couldn't have a girl as school captain. In my mind, I've got to think of the pressure as well that it would place upon them, the level of scrutiny there would be, because historically they would be the first ever.
Isn't that
girl.
a good thing?
It is, but what's their primary objective of being in our school? Their primary objective is to make sure they open the door to their next move, which...
That's the same for a boy.
It is, but I think a boy would come under less scrutiny than a girl would as the first ever school captain in our school.
You've got to do it one day.
It will happen. It will happen. It was very close this year.
Yeah. So, best person for the job.
It's the best person for the job. Yeah. But the other things. Sorry, the other thing that we've got to be, that I'm mindful of, is that we go through the process of selecting the school captain just after Christmas of year 12. Now, unfortunately, the girls have only joined us in September, whereas some of the boys have been with us since year 7. So we don't, if I'm honest, we don't really know them as well, and we don't know how we would best support them in that role.
Come on, Dorian, you've got to put a procedure in place that you can get a girl in there, overcome all of this.
Yeah,
you know,
I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think
and I'm playing devil's advocate here because I'm the student role here. But I do believe it actually.
It would be the best person. So we have a school's a student leadership team that is a balanced team, and it's probably more proportionally, because we don't have that many girls in the sixth form. In total, there are about 50 girls in a sixth form of 400. But they are statistically overrepresented in the student leadership team.
But not at the very top.
Not at the very top yet.
Yet. Okay. Another student question. I'm loving these. Why do you start GCSEs in year 9 when most schools start in year 10?
That's interesting, because there are...
You mean the rest of the questions haven't been?
No. There are a couple of reasons why. One of them is based on the fact that when we used to start GCSEs all in year 10, when our students were in year 9 and they were being put through a curriculum that included subjects that they knew full well they would never take at GCSE, they lost focus. So a Latin class, for instance, when we taught Latin, was quite difficult to manage if you had a group of year 9 boys, most of whom knew full well that they were not going to do it at GCSE. And that caused some issues for us, and in some other subjects as well. The other thing that we do in our school, I think we're in the top 2% of schools for the number of GCSEs studied across the nation. So our students normally take 11 GCSEs.
Right. So you mean numbers that an actual student does individually rather than the range of GCSE?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that they would come out of year 11 with 11 GCSEs, which is unusually high.
And do they need that many?
No, no, they don't, but it maintains a breadth.
Right.
And that, again, because there are some subjects, for instance, RS, which everybody does in our school as a GCSE, and we give it enough time because we think there are certain things in there that would benefit everybody in the future. The idea of tolerance, having an understanding of other cultures. So if you have 11 GCSEs and you try and shoehorn that into 2 years, that's going to be really hard. But I also wanted to make sure that we could have opportunities within, let's say, business, so they could do more case studies, that they could do a tenor challenge, for instance. So it's not just teaching. There's actually an application part as well. It's not just teaching to the exam. It's actually developing that deeper understanding.
You mentioned Latin as being one of the
Yes, yeah.
courses that you taught. I did Latin at school as well all those years ago. Even then, it was difficult to find teachers who taught it. And I guess if you were to teach it now, it'd be even more difficult.
And
But
that's the reason we stopped doing it. It
yeah,
wasn't because of the and the same for Mandarin as well.
right.
We have dabbled with that. I know, particularly Michael Gove, when he was in office, would say, "Oh, everyone should be teaching Mandarin." Well,
Yeah,
yeah, that's fine, but give me the teachers. And if you've got that, if you're offering that and the teacher's away, how do you set the work?
yeah.
If it's in any other subject, I've got a reasonable chance of doing it.
Spreading that a little bit wider, recruitment as a whole, how difficult is that?
It's becoming more difficult.
I mean, you're an aspirational school for teachers as well. They want to come to you,
I'm
but
shaking my head because it doesn't quite work that way.
really,
No, because the perception, and we battle against this constantly. There's a perception that I'm not good enough to teach in a grammar school.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So and we do have some pupils who are frighteningly bright and will push you
yeah,
academically, and I find that a joy. But some staff would be very reluctant to put themselves in that firing line, if you like.
yeah.
And it's all about if you're willing to engage with the students, not you knowing everything, but you having the honesty to say, I don't know that, I'll go and find out.
Right,
And if you go and find out, then your credibility increases in the student's eyes.
right.
Yeah.
So, do your students, are they guilty of placing unreasonable expectations on your staff as well, do you think?
I wouldn't say they're unreasonable.
Hmm.
I mean, I think there's what I will say to anyone that comes to us. So recruitment is difficult, and I think it is difficult in our context because of the area, the nature of the school, and everything else. But anyone that comes to us, I say, you only need to do two things. You need to demonstrate two things for me. You need to demonstrate that you're passionate about the subject, and you need to demonstrate that you care for the students.
Right.
If you can demonstrate those two things, your life in my school will be a dream. If there's an issue with either of those, if you're not committed to either of those fully, then our students are bright enough to make life a little bit more difficult.
What's your view on university education and all that that entails in terms of student loans, that sort of thing, versus apprenticeships?
This is where I start waving a little red flag, probably.
What, at me? Or
No, because I don't like the idea of students having debt.
yeah,
I was fortunate enough to go through a system where, because my father had taken early retirement just before I went to university, I got a grant. I got a maintenance grant, so I came out of my degree without any debt at all.
yeah,
If from my background, if I had been faced with the prospect of debt, I wouldn't have gone to university.
yeah,
My children haven't gone to university. Their choice, I would have supported them, but they chose not to because of that idea of debt. And I think that's unfortunate in a way. But then I also think that there's a pressure on students, young people, that university is the only option. And I'm not sure why that proportion of the population has to go to university other than to reduce the unemployment figures.
Yeah.
I think we don't as a society value the range of skills that our society needs. So we might be sending people off to university to do a degree which actually will have very little application in the future.
Yeah.
And then the individual is burdened with debt. I'm not sure what the benefit is. So I think that explosion of university places that there were, I don't think that was thought through, really. I much prefer the apprenticeship route, the degree apprenticeship route. I think that's, for most people, is a more sensible route, and we promote it highly in school. There are some subjects which don't lend themselves to that, and there is obviously merit in those as well. But I think we need to ask a young person who wants to go to university, why do you want to go? Do you have a real reason for going, or is it simply because you think that is the natural consequence of being in a school and getting A levels, that you will then go off and go to university? As a society, we know we don't have enough people doing bricklaying, electrics, plumbing, all of those skills, and those they seem to be less valued than they should be.
Yeah, I mean, not everybody can be academically brilliant, but if it takes all sorts to make a society.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I, in that very chair that you're in now, I've had a couple of MPs actually. I put this as an idea. If somebody is leaving sixth form, going to university and wants to be a doctor, dentist, engineer or something like that, I said, why don't you incentivize that if they go and work for the NHS or something afterwards, rather than them being fearful that they've got, a lifetime of debt to look forward to. And I got a kind of lukewarm response. Well, it's a theory, but I just don't understand why somebody can't grasp that. We've got a skills shortage in the medical world. That's one way that would encourage people.
See, it always used to be, I'm not sure whether it's the case anymore, that if you went off to study medicine and you joined the army,
right,
the army would say to you, if you serve 5 years in the army medical corps, you have no debt at the end of it.
Right.
And that's the same philosophy. And I think it's about what benefit we as a society are getting out of it. I would prefer, controversially, for us to offer fewer university places, but make them fully funded in the subjects that we need.
Yeah, I agree with you for what it's worth.
So that young people do not have to factor in the debt.
In my particular industry, which is media, it's a staggering statistic. I don't know if it still holds true, but it certainly did, that each and every year coming out of university were more graduates with media related degrees than there were actual jobs, full or otherwise, in the whole industry.
Yeah.
And I always took the view that universities, happy to take the £9,000 a year, whatever, delivering false promises in some ways. What do you think that's a fair comment?
I think it is fair, because I think that, and I also wonder in some industries the value of a degree.
Yeah.
Because
I don't have one in mind.
What does a degree actually teach them? Because some of them, and particularly now with the advances in AI and everything else, it's moving so quickly. Sometimes the content of the degree is no longer relevant by the time they come out. And actually, if they were doing the job, they'd be assimilating all of that on the way. And that's where I think a degree apprenticeship or some form of apprenticeship, not necessarily a degree apprenticeship, would be more appropriate for a lot of industries.
We're coming to the end, but there's something you mentioned in AI again. I just want to squeeze this one in. Are you fearful of people using AI to cheat their way through education?
Absolutely. So I think that's where the face-to-face work has to come. So I would be an advocate of saying that whilst AI can be used for research, can be used to help construct things, ultimately someone's got to be able to answer the question in front of me without access to any IT.
So I keep leading into more questions. I was thinking I was about to wrap it then, but But do you think then that there should be a change in the way that exams are done because of that, or the emphasis on exams?
I think the whole I was a little bit disappointed with the curriculum review that's been published, because I think it's almost doing a holding. It's not really looking much beyond the next 5 years and thinking, okay, how do we change this? I think the idea of having some form of viva, if you like, which I had to go through with my PhD, is actually in some ways more important, because you're looking not just whether they have the knowledge, but whether they can communicate it.
We've covered so much in just under an hour, I guess, and it's been fantastic. I've learned so
Thank you.
much from you, and I really appreciate your open answers as well.
Okay.
That goes down really well. So
Yeah,
thanks for coming in, Dorian.
it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's it for this week. We've got a couple of weeks where we need to be doing other things in our day job. So why not take the opportunity to catch up on any episodes that you've missed so far? We're going to be back in early December with a very, very high profile guest. So don't forget to subscribe, if I can get my teeth in, and look out for that one. See you soon.